The December wind bit through Grace Whitmore's wool coat as she stood at her office window on the 43rd floor, watching the snow blanket downtown Chicago in white. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the temperature seep through, and wondered when her life had become so isolated that even weather felt like an abstract concept rather than something to actually experience. Below, people hurried along sidewalks, bundled against the cold, probably rushing home to families, to warmth, to lives that existed beyond quarterly reports and board meetings. Her assistant knocked softly before entering. "Miss Whitmore, the Peterson contract is ready for your signature, and maintenance called about your driveway. Their regular service can't make it out to your property. The storm is hitting the suburbs harder than downtown." Grace turned from the window, her dark hair still perfectly styled despite the 14-hour workday. At 32, she had built Whitmore Consulting from the ground up, turning a modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar empire. The cost had been relationships, spontaneity, and apparently a plowed driveway. "Find someone local then. There must be someone who can handle it. I'll make some calls," her assistant promised, already pulling out her phone. 2 hours later, Grace's sleek black sedan navigated the increasingly treacherous roads toward her home in Riverside Oaks, an exclusive community where houses sat on 2-acre lots and neighbors knew each other's names but little else. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Found someone. Ian Erikson. He'll be there at 7 tomorrow morning. Comes highly recommended by the local community center." Grace barely registered the name as she pulled into her driveway, or rather, attempted to. The snow had drifted nearly 2 feet high at the entrance. She parked on the street instead, her designer heels immediately sinking into the powder as she made her way to her front door. The house loomed dark and silent, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel that had been featured in Architectural Digest. It was also profoundly empty. Inside, she kicked off her wet shoes and padded across heated marble floors to the kitchen, where she opened the refrigerator to find yogurt, bottled water, and takeout containers from restaurants whose names she couldn't remember. Grace grabbed the least suspicious-looking container and ate standing up at the counter, scrolling through emails on her phone. This was her life. This was what success looked like. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of an engine rumbling outside. She glanced at her clock, 6:45. Someone was early. She pulled on a cashmere robe and moved to the window, peering out at her driveway where an older pickup truck sat idling, a plow attachment fixed to its front. A man climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a thick work jacket and boots that had clearly seen many winters. Even from this distance, she could see the efficiency in his movements as he assessed the job ahead. Grace made coffee and was halfway through her first cup when her doorbell rang. She tightened her robe and answered, finding herself face to face with the man from the truck. He had kind eyes, she noticed immediately, the color of warm honey, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who spent significant time outdoors. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly from beneath a knit cap. "Miss Whitmore, Ian Erikson. I wanted to check if you need walkways cleared in addition to the driveway, and whether you want me to clear around your garage entrance specifically." His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that commanded attention without demanding it. Grace found herself nodding. "Yes, please." "All of it. I need to get out by 8. "You'll be clear by 7:30, he assured her, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Storm's supposed to hit again tonight. You might want to consider a contract for the season. I can come after each snowfall." "Fine. Whatever you think is necessary." Grace was already mentally cataloging the meetings she had that day, barely focused on the conversation. Ian nodded slowly, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll draw up something reasonable. Have a good day, Miss Whitmore." True to his word, by 7:30, her driveway was immaculate. Grace watched from her bedroom window as Ian made a final pass, the snow pushed into neat banks on either side. His truck was old but well-maintained, she noted, and he worked with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. There was something almost meditative about the way he maneuvered the vehicle, careful and precise. She thought little more about it until that evening when the predicted storm arrived with a vengeance. By the time Grace made it home at 9, exhausted from a day of back-to-back meetings and a confrontation with a difficult client, her driveway was once again buried. But as her headlights swept across the front of her property, she saw that someone had already been there. A path had been cleared from the street to her front door, and her driveway, while snowed on, had clearly been plowed within the last few hours. A business card was tucked into her door frame. Ian Erikson, landscaping and snow removal. She flipped it over to find a handwritten note. Came by around 7. Will be back in the morning to clear the overnight accumulation. Stay warm. Something about the gesture, small as it was, made Grace pause. When was the last time anyone had done something thoughtful without being asked? Without expecting anything in return beyond payment for services rendered over the next 2 weeks, as winter tightened its grip on Chicago, Grace began to notice things. Ian always arrived early, before she left for work. He was meticulous, clearing not just her driveway, but also making sure the path to her mailbox was accessible, that snow wasn't piled where it might block her view when backing out. Once, when an ice dam formed near her garage, he spent extra time carefully chipping it away, refusing additional payment when she offered. Part of the service, he said simply. Grace found herself timing her morning routine to coincide with his arrival, though she told herself it was merely to ensure the work was done properly. She would stand at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching him work. There was a quiet competence to everything he did, a lack of pretense that she found increasingly appealing in her world of corporate posturing and strategic networking. 3 weeks into their arrangement, a water pipe burst in Grace's basement during a particularly brutal cold snap. She discovered it at 6 in the morning, water seeping up through the floorboards near her home gym. In a panic, she called her property management company, only to reach an answering service that promised someone would call her back within 24 hours. 24 hours. My basement is flooding. She stood in her kitchen, still in her pajamas, contemplating her options when she heard Ian's truck pull up. Without overthinking it, she grabbed her coat and rushed outside. "Ian!" She waved him down as he climbed out of his truck. "I'm sorry to bother you, but do you know anything about plumbing? I have a burst pipe and my management company is useless." He was already moving toward her house. "Show me." Grace led him to the basement, acutely aware that she was in flannel pajamas and her hair was unbrushed. Ian surveyed the situation quickly, located the main water shutoff, and within minutes had the immediate crisis under control. "You'll need a plumber to properly fix this," he said, pulling out his phone. "But I know a good one who owes me a favor. Let me make a call." By 8 that morning, the plumber had arrived and Ian had helped move everything in the affected area to prevent further damage. Grace stood in her kitchen, overwhelmed by both the situation and the kindness of a man who was technically just her snow removal contractor. "I don't know how to thank you," she said as Ian prepared to leave. "Please send me a bill for your time." Ian shook his head. "Neighbor helping neighbor, no charge." "We're not really neighbors," Grace pointed out. "You're providing a service I'm paying for. Maybe." He met her eyes, and she felt something shift in the air between them. But helping people when they need it doesn't always have to be a transaction. After he left, Grace sat at her kitchen table, her coffee long cold, thinking about his words. In her world, everything was a transaction. Relationships were networked, connections were leveraged, and kindness always had a price tag attached. The idea that someone might help simply because it was the right thing to do felt almost foreign. That evening, she found herself looking up Ian's business online. His website was simple but professional, offering landscaping services in summer and snow removal in winter. There were testimonials from satisfied customers, many mentioning his reliability and fair pricing. One review from a single mother mentioned how he had cleared her driveway for free after her husband passed away, refusing payment until she was back on her feet. Grace stared at those words for a long time. The next morning, she was waiting outside when Ian arrived, holding a travel mug of coffee she had made specifically for him. "Peace offering for dragging you into my basement crisis," she said, handing it to him. Ian looked surprised, but accepted it with a smile that transformed his entire face. "You didn't have to do that. I know." Grace found herself smiling back. Neighbor helping neighbor, right? Something changed after that morning. Their interactions, previously brief and professional, began to extend a few minutes longer. Grace learned that Ian was 34, a widower with a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie. His wife had died from cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him to navigate single parenthood while keeping his small business afloat. She was the organized one, Ian admitted one morning, accepting another cup of coffee. "She handled all the scheduling, the billing, the customer service. I just did the work. When she died, I had to figure out how to do both, plus being a full-time parent." "That must be incredibly difficult," Grace said, and meant it. Ian shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both acceptance and lingering pain. "You do what you have to do. Sophie needs me. That's what matters." Grace found herself thinking about Ian throughout her days. During board meetings, she would wonder if Sophie had a good day at school. While reviewing contracts, she would mentally compose questions to ask him the next morning. It was absurd, really. She barely knew him. Yet something about his presence had begun to feel essential, like a bookmark in the story of her days. February arrived with a false thaw, followed by a devastating ice storm. Grace's office closed early, and she made it home just as the freezing rain began in earnest. She watched from her window as the world transformed into crystal, beautiful and treacherous. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ian. "Don't go outside. Ice is dangerous. Stay put. We'll check on you in the morning." The fact that he thought to text her, to make sure she was safe, created a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her heated house. The next morning revealed a landscape of ice. Trees bowed under the weight, power lines sagged dangerously, and the roads were impassable. Grace woke to find her power out, her house rapidly cooling despite its excellent insulation. She bundled into layers and was contemplating her options when she heard an engine outside. Ian's truck, moving slowly and carefully, pulled into her driveway. He climbed out wearing ice cleats on his boots, carrying a bag and a thermos. Grace opened the door before he could knock. "Your power's out," he stated, not a question. "How did you know?" "Everyone's is out in this neighborhood. Lines are down on Maple Street." He held up the thermos. "Brought hot coffee and some breakfast. My place has a generator." Grace should have declined. She should have maintained professional boundaries. Instead, she found herself stepping aside to let him in, grateful for both the coffee and the company. They sat at her kitchen table, the room gradually brightening as morning light reflected off the ice-covered world outside. Ian had brought muffins from a local bakery, still warm somehow, and they ate while he told her about Sophie's delight at the unexpected school closure. "She's with my mother today," he explained. "Mom lives a few streets over, has a wood-burning fireplace, and enough supplies to outlast an apocalypse. Sophie thinks it's a grand adventure." "Your mother helps you with child care?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about the logistics of his life. "Couldn't manage without her," Ian admitted. "She picks Sophie up from school, watches her when I have late jobs. My sister helps too when she can. It takes a village, you know." Grace didn't know, actually. She had no siblings, and her parents had passed away within a year of each other while she was building her business. She had thrown herself into work, using it as both a distraction and a purpose. The idea of having a support system, people who showed up just because they cared, seemed almost mythical. "What about you?" Ian asked. "Any family in the area?" "No, it's just me." The words sounded lonelier out loud than they did in her head. Ian regarded her thoughtfully. That must get quiet. I'm used to it, Grace said, and realized that being used to something didn't make it good. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily. Ian told her about Sophie's obsession with dinosaurs, his daughter's determined belief that she would discover a new species someday. Grace found herself sharing stories about building her company, the risks she had taken, the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. You should be proud, Ian said simply. That takes courage. No one had ever called her courageous before. Driven, yes. Ambitious, certainly. But courage implied vulnerability, the possibility of failure, and Ian seemed to understand that success was never guaranteed, that every achievement carried the weight of all the things that could have gone wrong. The power remained out for 2 days. Ian checked on Grace each morning and evening, bringing food and hot drinks, making sure she was safe. On the second night, when temperatures dropped dangerously low, he showed up at her door with a serious expression. Pack a bag, he said. You can't stay here tonight without heat. It's going to hit single digits. I'll get a hotel, Grace started, but Ian shook his head. Hotels are full. People from all over the county are without power. You can stay at my place. I have the guest room set up, plenty of space. Grace should have argued, should have found another solution. But the truth was, she was cold and tired, and the idea of Ian's warm house, of not being alone, was too appealing to resist. His home was a modest 2-story in an older neighborhood, nothing like her glass and steel showpiece, but it radiated warmth and life. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, books spilled from shelves in the living room, and everything showed signs of being actually lived in. Sophie was already asleep, Ian's mother having taken her to bed before heading back to her own home. Guest rooms upstairs, second door on the right, Ian said, showing Grace around. Bathrooms across the hall. Make yourself comfortable. The guest room was simple but cozy, with a thick quilt on the bed and curtains that matched the pillowcases. Grace set down her overnight bag and returned downstairs to find Ian in the kitchen, heating soup on his gas stove. Figured you might be hungry, he said, ladling the soup into bowls. It's just chicken noodle, nothing fancy. They ate at his kitchen table, and Grace couldn't remember the last time a meal had tasted so good. Maybe it was the cold she had endured for 2 days, or maybe it was the simple pleasure of sharing food with someone who cared whether she was warm and fed. Tell me about Sophie, Grace said. You mentioned dinosaurs, but what else does she love? Ian's entire face softened. Everything, honestly. She's at that age where the whole world is fascinating. Right now it's dinosaurs, last month it was outer space, before that it was marine biology. She reads constantly, asks a million questions. She's smart like her mother was. I'd like to meet her, Grace said, surprising herself. She'd like that too. She's been asking about the fancy lady I plow for. Fancy lady, Grace laughed despite herself. Her words, not mine. Though you do wear a lot of designer clothes for someone who works from home half the time. Grace looked down at her current outfit, casual by her standards but probably expensive by most people's. I never thought about it. That's how I knew you had money, Ian said with a gentle smile. People who have to think about it always know exactly what things cost. It wasn't said with judgment, just observation, but it made Grace consider her privilege in a way she hadn't before. She had worked hard for her success, yes, but she had also started with advantages. An inheritance, connections, education. Ian had built his business with his own hands, quite literally, while also raising a daughter and grieving a wife. That night, Grace lay in the guest bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's house. Footsteps on the stairs, pipes humming, the furnace kicking on. Normal sounds that her house never made because it was just her, alone in too much space. She thought about Ian, probably in his own room down the hall, and felt a longing she hadn't allowed herself in years. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of a child's laughter. She dressed quickly and ventured downstairs to find Ian at the stove, flipping pancakes while a little girl sat at the table, coloring intently. "Morning," Ian said, spotting her. "Grace, this is Sophie." "Soph, this is Miss Whitmore, the lady I've been telling you about." Sophie looked up, revealing her father's honey-colored eyes in a face that must have resembled her mother's. "Hi, Dad makes the best pancakes. Do you want some? He made extra." "I'd love some," Grace said, charmed by the girl's enthusiasm. She sat at the table while Ian served breakfast, and Sophie immediately launched into a detailed explanation of the dinosaur she was coloring, a brachiosaurus. And did Grace know that they were one of the tallest dinosaurs and probably had to eat constantly because they were so big? "I didn't know that," Grace admitted. "You must know a lot about dinosaurs." "I'm going to be a paleontologist," Sophie declared with absolute certainty. "I'm going to discover a new species and name it after Mom." Ian's hand hesitated for just a moment over the stove, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "That's a great plan, sweetheart." Grace spent the morning at Ian's house, and it was one of the most unexpectedly pleasant mornings of her life. Sophie was endlessly entertaining, full of questions and observations. Ian moved through his home with the easy competence of a single parent, managing breakfast, helping Sophie with a puzzle, fielding work calls about rescheduled plowing jobs, all while making it look effortless. When her power was reported restored, Grace felt genuine disappointment. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said as she gathered her things. "You really saved me." "Anytime," Ian said, and she believed he meant it. "That's what friends do. Friends." The word stayed with Grace as she drove home, as she walked through her immaculate, impersonal house, as she tried to return to her normal routine. Were they friends? When had that happened? And why did the thought make her feel both happy and terrified? Work should have consumed her attention, but Grace found herself distracted. During conference calls, she thought about Ian's smile. While reviewing budgets, she remembered Sophie's dinosaur facts. She was turning into someone she didn't recognize, someone who checked the weather forecast hoping for snow, who lingered over morning coffee because it meant a few extra minutes of conversation. "You seem different," her assistant commented one afternoon. "Happier, maybe." Was she happier? Grace examined the question. She was certainly more confused, more uncertain about what she wanted from her life. But yes, perhaps underneath the confusion, there was happiness too. March arrived with more snow, then a warm spell that felt like spring before winter reasserted itself with one final storm. Grace's contract with Ian was set to end at the start of April, and she found herself dreading it. What excuse would she have to see him then? She couldn't exactly hire him to plow a driveway in summer. The last storm of the season hit on a Saturday. Grace was home, working on quarterly reports when Ian's truck appeared. But this time, Sophie was with him, bundled up and sitting in the passenger seat. Grace watched as the little girl climbed out, carefully making her way to the front door while Ian began plowing. Grace answered Sophie's knock immediately. "Hey, Sophie, is everything okay? Dad's watching me today because Grandma's sick, and I asked if I could say hi." The girl looked uncertain suddenly. "Is that okay? Dad says I shouldn't bother people when they're working." "You're not bothering me at all," Grace assured her. "Would you like to come in for hot chocolate?" Sophie's face lit up. She turned and waved at Ian, who had stopped the truck and was watching them. Grace gave him a questioning look, and he nodded, giving permission. Making hot chocolate for Sophie, Grace felt out of her depth. She didn't have marshmallows, didn't even have real cocoa powder, just some fancy drinking chocolate a client had given her as a gift. But Sophie seemed delighted with it anyway, sitting at the kitchen counter and looking around with curious eyes. "Your house is really pretty," Sophie said. "It looks like a museum." From anyone else, Grace might have taken it as a compliment. From this 7-year-old, she heard the unspoken observation. It looked like a place where people visited but didn't live. "It's probably too big for just me," Grace admitted. "You live here all by yourself." Sophie's eyes widened. Don't you get lonely? Sometimes, Grace heard herself say, more honest with this child than she had been with anyone in years. You should get a dog, Sophie advised seriously. Or a cat, or maybe a fish if you're gone a lot. My teacher has a fish, and she says it's good company even though it can't talk. Grace smiled. Those are good suggestions. They talked while Sophie finished her hot chocolate, and Grace found herself telling this little girl things she rarely shared with anyone. About how she had started her company, about the long hours and hard decisions, about loving her work, but sometimes wondering what she had missed by focusing so completely on her career. Sophie listened with the intense focus children sometimes have, then said, "My dad works really hard too. But he always makes time for me. He says I'm the most important thing." "You're very lucky," Grace said softly. "I know, I miss my mom, but Dad's really good at being both." When Ian knocked on the door 40 minutes later, finished with the driveway, he found Sophie and Grace looking at photos on Grace's tablet, pictures from a business trip to Japan. Sophie was fascinated by everything, asking questions faster than Grace could answer them. "Sorry," Ian said, looking between them. "Sophie, I told you not to overstay your welcome." "She's not," Grace said quickly. "I've enjoyed the company." Ian's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a current of understanding and attraction that Grace could no longer deny. She was falling for him, had probably been falling for him since that first morning when he asked about her walkways, careful and considerate in ways she hadn't expected. "Grace, I was wondering," Ian started, then seemed to reconsider. "Never mind." "Come on, Soph, we should let Grace get back to work." "Wait," Grace said. "What were you going to say?" Ian glanced at Sophie, who was conveniently very focused on putting on her coat. "I was going to ask if you'd like to have dinner sometime, with me, as more than just a client or friend." He rushed on before she could answer. "I know we're probably from different worlds and you're busy, and I have Sophie to think about, so if this is completely inappropriate, just forget I said anything." Grace's heart was pounding. "I'd love to have dinner with you." The smile that spread across Ian's face was worth every moment of fear that preceded it. "Yeah, okay, good, great, I'll call you." "You'd better," Grace said, matching his smile with her own. After they left, Grace stood in her kitchen, feeling like her life had just shifted on its axis. She was Grace Whitmore, CEO, businesswoman, someone who controlled every aspect of her carefully constructed world. And she had just agreed to go on a date with a man who drove a Plow truck and had a daughter obsessed with dinosaurs. It made absolutely no sense. It felt absolutely right. Their first date was the following Friday. Ian picked her up at 7, cleaned up but still unmistakably himself in jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out the gold in his eyes. Grace had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on nice slacks and a cashmere sweater, dressy but not too formal. "You look beautiful," Ian said when she answered the door, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood Grace had never visited, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and bread served in baskets. It was nothing like the upscale restaurants where she usually had business dinners, and it was perfect. They talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing as easily as it had over morning coffee, but deeper now, more intentional. Ian told her about his wife, Rebecca, about their high school romance and quick marriage, and the way cancer had stolen her too soon. Grace shared her own story, the loneliness of her childhood as an only child of distant parents, the way she had built her company partially to prove something to people who were no longer alive to see it. "Do you regret it?" Ian asked. "The choices you made?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I'm proud of what I've built, but sometimes I wonder what else I could have built instead, or in addition to." "It's not too late," Ian said simply. "Life doesn't end just because you're 32, says the man who's had to rebuild his entire life with a young daughter to care for. Exactly. So I know what I'm talking about." Ian reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "It's never too late to choose something different, Grace." The touch of his hand, warm and calloused, sent electricity through her. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his, and felt something slot into place inside her chest. Their second date was a week later, a Sunday afternoon at a children's museum because Sophie wanted to go. And Ian wanted Grace to be part of his life, which meant being part of Sophie's life too. Grace had never spent much time around children, but Sophie made it easy, pulling her from exhibit to exhibit, excited to share everything. "Look at this, Grace. It's a replica of a triceratops skull. Did you know they had beaks like parrots?" Ian watched them with an expression Grace couldn't quite read, something tender and hopeful. Later, when Sophie was occupied with an interactive dig site, he stood beside Grace and said quietly, "She really likes you." "I really like her," Grace said, and meant it. Sophie was bright and funny and surprisingly wise for 7. Being around her made Grace think about all the things she had told herself she didn't want or need. They dated through the end of March and into April, a careful courtship that felt old-fashioned and right. Ian never pushed, always conscious of his responsibilities as a father and his respect for Grace's time. But the connection between them deepened with each conversation, each shared meal, each moment stolen between their busy lives. Grace met Ian's mother, Dorothy, a sharp-eyed woman who sized Grace up in about 30 seconds and then apparently approved, because she hugged her and said, "About time Ian found someone who makes him smile like that." Ian's sister, Jennifer, was equally welcoming, inviting them to a family barbecue where Grace found herself surrounded by the kind of warm, chaotic family gathering she had only seen in movies. People talked over each other, children ran through the yard, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be together. It was overwhelming and wonderful. "They liked you," Ian said later as he drove her home. "My mother said you're a keeper." "Your mother is slightly terrifying," Grace admitted. Ian laughed. "She means well. She's just protective. After Rebecca died, she worried I'd never find someone again, or that I'd settle for someone who wasn't right." "And am I right?" Grace asked, her heart in her throat. Ian pulled the truck over on a quiet residential street and turned to face her. "You're more than right. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, and Grace felt like she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. His hand cupped her face gently, and she leaned into him, everything else falling away until there was just this. Just them, just the perfect rightness of being together. As spring fully arrived, Grace's life began to change in ways both subtle and profound. She left work earlier, prioritizing dinners with Ian and Sophie. She said no to weekend conferences, choosing instead to attend Sophie's soccer games or help Ian with his weekend landscaping jobs. Her assistant noticed, her board members noticed, and surprisingly, Grace didn't care as much as she thought she would. "I'm in love with him," she told her assistant one afternoon, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I know," her assistant said with a knowing smile. "You've been different for months, happier. It's good to see." But being in love with Ian meant facing the realities of their different lives. Grace had money, security, and a career that had defined her for a decade. Ian was comfortable but not wealthy, working hard to provide for Sophie and save for her future. The disparity felt more stark as their relationship deepened. "Does it bother you?" Grace asked him one evening as they sat on her back patio, watching the sunset. "That I have more money than you." Ian was quiet for a moment. "I'd be lying if I said it never crosses my mind. I can't take you to fancy restaurants or buy you expensive gifts, but that's ego talking. What matters is that we treat each other as equals, that I don't take advantage and you don't use it to have power over me." "I would never do that," Grace said firmly. "I know, that's why this works." He pulled her closer. "You see me, Grace, not what I do or what I have, just me. That's all that matters." In May, Ian's truck broke down, the transmission finally giving out after years of hard use. Grace was with him when the mechanic delivered the news, $7,000 to repair, or it was time for a new vehicle. "I'll figure it out," Ian said, his jaw tight. Maybe I can find a used transmission, do some of the work myself. Grace wanted to help, wanted to write a check and make the problem disappear, but she understood enough about Ian's pride to know that would damage something important between them. Instead, she said, "What if you let me loan you the money? You can pay me back over time, no interest." "Grace, you'd do it for me if positions were reversed," she interrupted. "You helped me when my pipe burst. You brought me food during the ice storm. Let me help you now." Ian struggled with it. She could see it on his face. Finally, he nodded. "A loan, I'll pay you back every penny." "I know you will." It was a small thing, but it felt significant. They were learning to navigate their differences, to support each other without undermining each other's dignity. Grace was learning that love wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts, but about showing up, being present, choosing each other every day. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ian kissed Grace goodnight at his front door. The kisses had been growing more heated lately, the pull between them increasingly difficult to resist. Grace pressed against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt him shake with restraint. "I want you to stay," Ian murmured against her lips. "But Sophie's here, and I want to do this right." "I know." Grace rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart racing. "I should go anyway, early meeting tomorrow." But she didn't move, and neither did he, standing in his doorway holding each other like teenagers, the wanting almost as sweet as the having. June brought Sophie's 8th birthday, and Ian asked Grace to help plan the party. They decided on a dinosaur theme, naturally. And Grace found herself in the unfamiliar territory of party supply stores, picking out decorations and goodie bags. It should have been strange, but it felt natural, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The party was held at a local park, attended by Sophie's friends from school and soccer, along with Ian's family. Grace helped Ian set up, supervised games, and found herself laughing more than she had in years. Watching Sophie open presents, her face glowing with joy, Grace felt a fierce protectiveness and love for this child who had welcomed her so completely into her life. "Make a wish," Ian said as Sophie bent over her cake, ready to blow out the candles. Sophie closed her eyes tight, then opened them and looked directly at Grace before blowing out the candles. Later, when Grace asked what she had wished for, Sophie just smiled mysteriously and said, "Can't tell or it won't come true." But Ian's mother pulled Grace aside and said quietly, "She wished for a mom." "She's been wishing for that for a while now, but I think this year she has someone specific in mind." The words should have terrified Grace. She had never wanted children, had always assumed she was too focused on her career for motherhood, but the thought of being Sophie's mother didn't scare her. It felt right, like another piece of her life clicking into place. That night after the party, after the cleanup, after Sophie was in bed, Ian walked Grace to her car. They stood in his driveway, the summer air warm and soft, neither wanting to say goodnight. "I love you," Ian said suddenly. "I know we haven't known each other that long, and I know our lives are complicated, but I love you, Grace. I think I started falling in love with you that first morning when you answered the door in your fancy bathrobe, looking annoyed that I was early." Grace laughed, her eyes filling with tears. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since you fixed my basement flood and refused to let me pay you." Ian cupped her face in his hands. "I want a future with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want Sophie to have a mother who loves her. I want to build a life together." "Yes," Grace whispered. "Yes to all of it." They kissed under the stars, a kiss that felt like a promise, like the beginning of everything. The conversation about their future took place over the next several weeks. Grace's house or Ian's, neither felt quite right. Her place was too big, too impersonal. His place held memories of Rebecca, and while Grace respected that, she wanted them to start fresh together. They decided to look for something new, a house that would be theirs, where they could build their own memories. They also had to tell Sophie, which Ian was nervous about. Despite her birthday wish, there was a difference between hoping for something and having it actually happen. They took Sophie to her favorite ice cream shop and told her together that they were going to get married, that Grace was going to be part of their family officially. Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really? You're going to be my stepmom?" "If that's okay with you," Grace said carefully. "I know I can't replace your mom, and I wouldn't try to, but I love you and your dad very much, and I'd like to be a family." Sophie launched herself at Grace, wrapping her arms around her neck. I wished for this, and it came true." Ian's eyes were suspiciously bright as he watched them. Grace held Sophie tight and thought about how much her life had changed since that snowy morning in December when a struggling dad had shown up to plow her driveway. She had been so lonely then, so isolated in her success. Now she was surrounded by love, by family, by the messy, beautiful reality of life lived with other people. They found a house in late July, a 4-bedroom colonial with a big backyard and a neighborhood full of families. It was halfway between Grace's office and Ian's service area, perfect for both their needs. Sophie picked out her room immediately, already planning how she would decorate it. "Are you sure about this?" Ian asked Grace as they stood in the empty master bedroom. "You're giving up a lot." "Your house, your independence, the life you built." "I'm not giving up anything," Grace corrected. "I'm gaining everything that matters. You, Sophie, a real life. My house was just a building. This will be a home." They were married in September, a small ceremony in Dorothy's backyard with close friends and family. Sophie was Grace's maid of honor, taking her responsibilities very seriously. Grace wore a simple ivory dress, and Ian wore a suit that made him look devastatingly handsome. When they exchanged vows, Grace's voice caught on the words, overcome by the reality of this moment, this man, this life she was choosing. "I promise to love you in the chaos and the quiet," she said. "To show up every day to choose us, to build something beautiful together." Ian's vows were equally simple and profound. "I promise to see you, all of you, forever, to support your dreams while building our own, to love you with everything I am." When they kissed, Sophie cheered loudly, and everyone laughed. Grace thought about the moment in her office tower, looking down at the snowy streets and feeling so separate from the world. Now she was part of it, woven into the fabric of other people's lives, and it was better than anything she could have imagined. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Grace had to learn how to share her space, her time, her life. She had to figure out how to be a stepmother, how to navigate the complex waters of discipline and affection with a child who had lost one mother and was learning to trust another. She had to balance her demanding career with family dinners and school events, and the 100 small ways that love manifests in daily life. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements about money and parenting, and whose turn it was to do the dishes. There were moments when Grace felt overwhelmed, when she missed the simplicity of her old life where she answered to no one and could work until midnight if she chose. But there were also mornings when she woke up next to Ian, his arm draped over her waist, and felt so grateful she could cry. There were evenings when Sophie ran to her first when she got home, eager to share something from school. There were family dinners full of laughter and conversation, movie nights cuddled on the couch, lazy Sunday mornings where none of them got dressed before noon. Grace also discovered that stepping back from work slightly didn't destroy her career. Her company thrived, perhaps better than before, because she was no longer micromanaging every detail. She promoted talented people and gave them autonomy, and they rose to the challenge. She learned to delegate, to trust, to accept that she didn't have to do everything herself. Ian's business grew too. With Grace's business acumen and connections, he expanded his services and hired 2 employees, giving him more flexibility and less physical strain. He was proud of what he had built, and Grace was proud of him. Sophie flourished. The stability of a 2-parent home, the love of a mother figure who showed up to her events and helped with homework and listened to endless dinosaur facts, made a visible difference. She was more confident, more open, still the bright, curious girl she had always been, but with an additional layer of security. On their first wedding anniversary, Ian gave Grace a framed photo from their wedding day. In it, they were kissing while Sophie jumped in the air behind them, her face split in a huge grin. "This is us," Ian said. "Imperfect and happy and together." Grace hung the photo in their bedroom where she could see it every morning. It reminded her of how far she had come, how much she had gained by opening her heart to love. They talked about having a baby, whether Grace wanted to experience pregnancy and biological motherhood. It was a complicated question. Grace loved Sophie completely, but she also felt the pull of wanting a child with Ian, a physical manifestation of their love. "Only if you want to," Ian insisted. "I'm happy with our family exactly as it is. Sophie is enough for me." But Grace realized she did want it. Wanted to see what a combination of her and Ian would look like, wanted to give Sophie a sibling, wanted the experience of creating new life. At 34, she wasn't getting any younger, and for the first time in her life, the timing felt right. They were pregnant by Christmas, and Sophie was ecstatic at the prospect of being a big sister. Grace navigated morning sickness and fatigue while trying to keep up with work, finally accepting that she needed to slow down to take care of herself and the baby. Ian was wonderful, attentive without being overbearing, excited but not pressuring. He came to every appointment, held her hair when she was sick, rubbed her feet when they swelled. Grace had never felt so cared for in her life. Their son, Matthew Ian Erikson, was born in early September, a healthy 8 pounds with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. Sophie held him in the hospital, tears streaming down her face, declaring him the best brother ever, even though he couldn't do anything yet. Grace, exhausted and overwhelmed and more in love than she thought possible, looked at her family gathered in the hospital room and felt complete. This was what she had been missing in her perfect, empty house. This messy, chaotic, beautiful love. Maternity leave was challenging. Grace had never been away from her company for so long, and she struggled with feeling out of the loop. But she also discovered the profound joy of those early weeks with Matthew, the sweetness of middle-of-the-night feedings when it was just the two of them, the way his tiny hand would grip her finger with surprising strength. Ian took time off too, and they navigated the chaos of a newborn together. Sophie helped in her own 8-year-old way, bringing diapers and singing to her brother and being remarkably patient with the disruption to her routine. "You're amazing at this," Ian told Grace one night as she rocked Matthew back to sleep. "I knew you would be." "I had no idea what I was doing," Grace admitted. "None of us do. We just figure it out as we go." Ian wrapped his arms around them both. "That's what family is." Grace returned to work part-time when Matthew was 3 months old, a compromise that let her stay involved with her company while being present for her family. It wasn't perfect, and she often felt pulled in too many directions, but she was learning that perfect wasn't the goal. Present was the goal. Engaged was the goal. Loving and loved was the goal. Sophie's 9th birthday party was a family affair, with Matthew in attendance as the guest of honor in many ways. Sophie was patient with all the attention her baby brother received, secure enough in her place in the family to be generous. "I have the best family," she announced during cake, unprompted. "My mom in heaven and my dad, and Grace who's my other mom, and Matthew who's my brother. I'm so lucky." Grace caught Ian's eye across the table, saw the love and gratitude reflected there, and knew exactly how Sophie felt. She was lucky, too. Lucky that her pipe had burst and she had asked for help. Lucky that Ian had seen past her designer clothes and expensive house to the lonely woman underneath. Lucky that they had both been brave enough to take a chance on love. As Matthew grew from an infant to a toddler, Grace settled into her role as mother with increasing confidence. She learned to function on less sleep, to split her attention between a demanding job and demanding children, to let go of her need for control and accept the beautiful chaos of family life. Ian continued to be her partner in every sense of the word. They shared responsibilities, supported each other's dreams, made decisions together. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows in the backyard of their home, surrounded by friends and family. Sophie, now 13 and on the verge of adolescence, stood beside them. Matthew, 4 years old and full of energy, was the ring bearer and took his job very seriously. 5 years ago, you were just the fancy lady who needed her driveway plowed, Ian said in his vows. Now you're my wife, my partner, the mother of my children, my best friend. You're everything. Grace's vows were equally heartfelt. You saved me from a life I didn't know was empty. You taught me what love looks like in action every single day. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose beyond work. You gave me everything that matters. That evening, after the guests left and the children were finally asleep, Grace and Ian sat on their back porch, watching fireflies dance across the yard. Matthew's toys were scattered across the lawn, and Sophie's bike leaned against the garage. The house behind them was a disaster of party decorations and dishes to be washed. It was imperfect and lived in and absolutely beautiful. "Do you ever miss it?" Ian asked, as he sometimes did. "Your old life?" Grace didn't have to think about her answer. Never, not for a second. Not even the quiet, the order, especially not that. She leaned against him, breathing in his familiar scent. "That wasn't living, Ian. It was existing. This is living." "This is chaos," Ian said with a laugh, "the best kind of chaos." Grace turned to kiss him. "The kind that makes every day an adventure." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Inside, their children slept safely. Around them, the evidence of a life fully lived was scattered in toys and dishes, and the 100 small markers of a family's existence. Grace thought about the woman she had been, standing at that office window, watching snow fall on a city where she had no connections. She had been so certain of what mattered then: success, achievement, building an empire. She hadn't been wrong exactly, but she had been incomplete. Now she understood that empires could be built in many ways. There was the company she had created, yes, but there was also this family they were building together, day by day. The business she ran would continue long after she was gone, passed to others or sold or transformed. But Sophie and Matthew, the love she and Ian shared, the memories they were creating together, those would ripple forward through generations, a different kind of legacy entirely. "Thank you," Grace said softly. "For what?" "For being early that first morning. For noticing I needed more than just a plowed driveway. For being patient while I figured out what I wanted. For loving me." Ian pulled her closer. "Grace, you had me at fancy bathrobe. Everything after that was just details." She laughed, the sound carrying across the yard. "Worst case of romantic attraction ever. Clearly I made an impression. The best impression." Ian's voice turned serious. "I was so lost when Rebecca died, just going through the motions, taking care of Sophie, but not really living either. Then this beautiful, successful woman opened her door and I saw loneliness that matched my own. I wanted to know you, not because you had money or status, but because I recognized something in you." "What did you recognize?" "Someone who was ready for more but didn't know how to reach for it." Grace considered his words. He was right. She had been ready, even if she hadn't consciously known it. Ready for love, for family, for a life that extended beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. She had just needed someone to show her the way, to take her hand and lead her into the messy, beautiful reality of shared life. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Sophie navigated high school, her dinosaur obsession having evolved into a serious interest in paleontology that guided her college choices. Grace helped her with applications and essays, drove her to campus visits, and tried not to cry at the thought of her leaving home. "You're a great mom," Sophie told her one evening as they worked on scholarship applications. "I know you're technically my stepmom, but you're just my mom to me. I hope you know that." Grace did cry then, pulling Sophie into a hug. "You made it easy to love you." Matthew grew into a thoughtful, creative child who loved art and music. He was different from Sophie in almost every way, but he adored his big sister and followed her around whenever she was home. Watching them together, Grace marveled at how completely she had embraced this ready-made family, how natural it had become. Ian's business continued to thrive, and he hired more employees, transitioning from doing the physical labor himself to managing operations. Grace's company went public, a milestone she had worked toward for years. The IPO made her even wealthier on paper, but it mattered less than it once would have. Money was a tool, useful and important, but not the measure of success she had once believed it to be. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they took a family trip to Montana, where Sophie was attending a paleontology dig for college students. They watched her work under the big sky, carefully brushing dirt from ancient bones, and Grace felt overwhelmingly proud. "Our kid is digging up dinosaurs," Ian whispered, awed. "Our kid," Grace repeated, loving how natural the phrase had become. That night, after Sophie returned to her dig site and Matthew was asleep in the hotel room, Grace and Ian walked through the small town, hand in hand under a blanket of stars more brilliant than any they saw at home. 10 years, Grace mused. "Remember when we were worried about whether we could make this work?" "I was never worried," Ian said. "I knew from the start." "Liar, you were terrified. I saw your face when you asked me to dinner." Ian laughed. "Okay, I was terrified, but I also knew some things you just know." They stopped walking, and Ian pulled Grace close. Even after 10 years, 3 children if you counted Matthew, and countless shared moments, his kiss still made her heart race. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love the life we have built. I love who we are together." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "Thank you for plowing my driveway. Best business decision I ever made." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the empty street. Then they walked back to their hotel, to their sleeping son, to the beautiful, ordinary life they had created. Time moved forward, as it always does. Sophie graduated college with honors and was accepted into a prestigious graduate program for paleontology. Matthew discovered a talent for painting and talked about art school. Grace stepped back further from her company, bringing in a CEO while remaining board chair, finally ready to prioritize family over work in a way she never had before. Ian's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, and they grieved together, remembering a woman who had welcomed Grace without hesitation, who had helped raise their children, who had shown Grace what unconditional family love looked like. They bought a small cabin by a lake, a place to escape and reconnect. On weekends, they would drive there, leaving behind the demands of work and school and daily life. They taught Matthew to fish, watched sunsets from the dock, read books in companionable silence, and reminded themselves why they had chosen this life. "Do you ever think about that first winter?" Grace asked Ian one evening as they sat by the fire in the cabin. Matthew was asleep upstairs, and Sophie was at school across the country, but they had video chatted earlier, her face glowing as she talked about a fossil discovery. "All the time," Ian admitted. "I think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't taken that job. If you hadn't needed your driveway plowed, such a small thing, but it changed everything." "Not small," Grace corrected. "It was the beginning of everything that matters." She rested her head on his shoulder, watching flames dance in the fireplace. Outside, snow was falling again, but unlike that first winter, Grace wasn't cold or lonely. She was warm and loved and exactly where she belonged. "I was so empty before you," she said quietly. "I had everything I thought I wanted and nothing I actually needed." "You gave me a reason to hope again," Ian replied. "After Rebecca, I thought I was done. One great love if I was lucky, and I should be grateful for that. I never imagined finding you." They sat in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes from years of shared life. Grace thought about the woman she had been, driven and ambitious and profoundly alone. She didn't regret her past, the work she had done, the company she had built. But she was grateful for the wisdom to recognize when something better came along, for the courage to reach for it. The kids want to throw us a 15th anniversary party, Ian said eventually. Sophie's already planning it. Matthew wants to paint something special. Grace smiled. They're good kids. The best. We got lucky. We made our luck. We chose each other, chose this family, chose love even when it was scary and uncertain. Ian kissed the top of her head. Best choice I ever made. Me too, Grace agreed. Me too. The snow continued to fall outside the cabin, blanketing the world in white. But inside they were warm, together, building a life moment by moment, choice by choice, shovelful by shovelful. It had started with a driveway that needed plowing and a lonely woman who opened her door. It had become everything. Their 15th anniversary party was everything Sophie had planned and more. The house was full of people they loved. Ian's sister and her family, friends from work, neighbors, Sophie's friends home from college, Matthew's art class classmates. Grace moved through the crowd, greeting guests, laughing at stories, and feeling profoundly grateful. Sophie gave a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how Grace had chosen to love her even though she didn't have to, how she had given her family back its wholeness. Matthew presented the painting he had made, a portrait of their family at the lake cabin, somehow capturing not just their faces but the love between them. Ian's speech was last. 15 years ago, I was just a guy trying to make a living and raise his daughter alone. Grace was a successful businesswoman who didn't need anyone or anything, but we found each other and we built this. He gestured around at the gathered crowd, the evidence of their life together. We built a family, a home, a love that gets stronger every year. Grace, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Here's to 15 more years and then 15 more after that. Grace couldn't speak through her tears, but she didn't need to. She kissed Ian in front of everyone, and their children groaned good-naturedly, and their friends cheered, and it was perfect later, after the guests had left and the children were asleep. Grace and Ian stood in their kitchen doing dishes together, a nightly ritual they both cherished. Grace washed while Ian dried, and they talked about the party, about Sophie's upcoming graduation, about Matthew's art show next month. Happy anniversary, Ian said, setting down his dish towel to pull her close. Happy anniversary, Grace echoed. I love you, I love this life. I love that I get to do dishes with you every night. Such a romantic, Ian teased. I am, Grace insisted. Because I know what romance really is. It's not grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's showing up day after day, choosing each other, building something together. It's plowing driveways and fixing pipes and making coffee. It's all the small things that add up to everything. Ian kissed her then, deep and sweet, a kiss that still made her knees weak after 15 years. You're right, he said when they finally broke apart. That's exactly what love is. They finished the dishes together, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Through the windows, Grace could see snow beginning to fall again, but unlike that first winter so many years ago, she didn't feel isolated by it. She felt connected, part of something larger than herself. In bed, Ian pulled her close, and Grace listened to his breathing even out as he fell asleep. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers to lovers to partners to family. She thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Hiring a struggling dad to plow her driveway, saying yes to dinner, choosing love over fear, building a life together. The snow continued to fall outside, gentle and persistent, covering the world in fresh white. Inside, Grace closed her eyes and drifted to sleep, warm and loved and profoundly grateful. Tomorrow there would be driveways to plow, both literal and metaphorical. There would be challenges and joys, ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. There would be life, messy and beautiful and absolutely worth living, and there would be love. Always, always, there would be love.